Hello, and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin, from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Januszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing this week?
Doing great, Eric. How about you? Happy April.
Happy April. Spring is underway.
Yeah, it's gorgeous out today.
And we are coming off some very strange weather around the country, but we've been very lucky here in the Northeast. So, reaching out to our listeners, hopefully you have not been affected by the tornadoes, etc., and all of the craziness that's going around. So, today we've got a special guest. We have Kate Mollison, and I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly.
You are.
Kate, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Now, Kate runs a grief counseling company called On Tuesday We Wear Black. And Kate, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so it really is something that I've created out of thin air. It's what I like to call grief alchemy. I was personally widowed in 2020. Unfortunate circumstance, I have to say, not COVID related. I feel like I have to preface that. So my husband Craig passed away in 2020 unexpectedly, and those first 2 years, are a fog, are really, really challenging. And there's lots of resources out there for the emotional, mental health support, but there isn't a whole lot out there for the tactical, practical, day-to-day, front lines of it. And my goal was to take the things that I learned about having to navigate the minutia of everyday life and give that skill and that resource to other people. So it's more of a grief coaching than a counseling. I'm like a wedding planner, but for funerals. And I do, consultative resource advocacy where I meet with clients in a one-on-one basis. They can be 3 days post grief, 3 weeks post grief, 3 years post grief, 30 years post grief. Really doesn't matter. There's always something to be done, a resource that's needed, hand holding to happen. And I'm the person that they can come to for that one-stop shop resource connection.
Fantastic. Now, Chip and I did an episode several months back dealing with what you need to do to get your estate in order, because both Chip and I have just recently gone through losses where we had to deal with this. But for those of you those people who haven't gotten things in order, it is absolute chaos. How do you help them?
So really it starts with, a conversation, something very informal. I want people to know, one, first and foremost, that I understand what they're going through. And they don't have to be widowed. I do help people who are, grieving the loss of a sibling, a parent, a child, their best friend. It's just about bringing education around grieving and the grieving process and bringing it out of the shadows. Nobody likes to talk about death because it makes them question their own morality. And for people who are looking to do planning for themselves, I can help them do that. But it's a conversation. It's like, where are you in your timeline? What are you looking to accomplish? And what can I take off your plate for you? So very simple. First question is like, do you have a funeral home? Where is the deceased one currently? And then we go through the processes, and I kind of have a checklist of like the steps that they follow immediately following the death of their loved one. But it can be as surface level or as deep as they need. It really is tailor-made to each individual situation.
And I've noticed as a supporter there, your website is quite comprehensive, and you have resource links for everything that you talked about there. I mean, they're just listed here: estate planning, financial planning, legal help, real estate, funeral, Social Security. It basically goes through all of these different check boxes. As Eric said, basically, I lost my mom in '91 last year. She had a great life, and he lost his mother-in-law last year too. And so I'm the co-executor, and I've been going through all this stuff, and I'm trying to finish things up. And obviously, having a resource to guide you through that is just wonderful. And the fact that you're doing this and sharing your story as a preface to this is just amazing. So condolences with what you had to go through, but kudos to you for sharing it forward and helping out so many people with all the research and everything that you've done since then, and your support.
Thank you. And my condolences to your losses as well. I know it's grief is not something that we get over or we accomplish or that goes away. It's something that becomes part of who we are and we learn to move forward with it. And there's a difference between moving on and moving forward. And I think that those are the conversations that get lost, in the day to day when we think about death, dying, grieving. It's you drop off the casserole, you deliver the sympathy card, you go to the services, and then you go back to Sunday brunch with your family. And what you don't realize is they're still actively grieving for long periods of time, maybe even forever. I'm real comfortable crying in the grocery store now. So, you get very good at being vulnerable and being raw. And not everybody is that type of person, and that's okay. But what I want to do for people with the resource consulting is to give them someone who can give them that time back. If I can do the tactical, practical stuff or show them how to streamline it, then they have that time to actively grieve, get emotional support, mental health services, and I do provide resources for all that stuff as well. Like I can refer you to a therapist, I can refer you to a medical doctor, I can refer you to addiction support services. 63% of all widows and widowers become addicted to some substance at some point in the 5 years following the death. That's a staggering number. And then you look at the suicide rate, related to substance abuse. It's like 1 every 6 minutes, a widow is committing suicide because of substance abuse, because of unresolved grief. So if I can intervene somewhere in the beginning and give them that roadmap, maybe that number comes down. And then his death wasn't in vain because I'm able to help people and bring to light the education around it. And so thank you for mentioning the website. It is a free educational resource blog where for the people who don't want the consultative services, I do anecdotal based monthly blogs, different topics. I think this past month was the dividends of death. So I talk about financial planning and insurances and different life insurance policy types. And I got to interview a couple of really great individuals who I met at the networking group where I met Eric. And they gave some great information about how to set yourself up for success and how to help people, once they've experienced that loss. Where do you find the information when, I didn't know my husband had a life insurance policy. And then when I found it, it was like, well, what do I do with this? So giving people that roadmap before something bad happens just cuts the trauma off at the pass.
That you were talking about the numbers of widows that have commit suicide and deal with grief, but you had also given me another number when we met at the networking event, and I'm forgetting the exact number, but it was the percentage of widows that were younger than we expected.
50% of all widows are under the age of 60.
Yeah, that's something most people don't think about. They think when they're going to have to deal with this, they'll be much older, they'll be more settled, and that's just not the case. Now, you were a very young widow when all of this took place, and you lost your husband 2 years ago. What was the biggest surprise that you encountered afterwards that you had to deal with?
Similarly to what you just said, that all of the resources out there, all of the support groups, all of the pamphlets and information are, I hate to say it, but pictures of old ladies, and nothing against them. But at the same token, there was nothing that resonated with me as a then 32-year-old with 2 small children. I felt very lost and very isolated and very alone. And all of that information was very much targeted as like, they lived a good life and you'll be okay because you're getting Social Security. And I'm like, but that's not exactly the case. And then in going through the process, finding out these numbers, it surprised me even more that there weren't more resources for, younger women. And I don't just specify widows. I do work with widowers, but statistically speaking, men die first. So we have to play the numbers game a little bit. But all the resources out there are either strictly mental health, which is necessary, or they're aimed at women in their 70s and 80s, and it's not helpful for women my age and younger, that bracket.
So when you saw these programs that all had pictures of 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, did that, as a younger person, did that put you off? Did that make you concerned that maybe these services weren't for you and made it a little harder for you to find what you were looking for?
I'm very much a type A, so I'm going to read anything that gets put in front of me and not knowing, which direction was up. I'm the type of person where like I'll cry about that later. I need to figure out, where the surface is. And having two small kids and my older disabled parents who were living with me at the time, I didn't have an option to not move. So that really was the motivation for me. But not everyone has that situation or that, drive. And that's perfectly okay. But so here I am, 2 a.m. thumbing through 37 pages of Google, trying to find things like, how do I file probate? How do I collect a life insurance policy? How do I, find out if he had a life insurance policy? How do I sell a house, get life insurance, file taxes? He did that for me. And I felt I'm an intelligent woman. I've got 2 college degrees. I work very hard. I like to think of myself as well spoken. But there was lots of stuff that all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. And then, even reading those resources because I'm that type A, there just wasn't any pertinent information. So it ultimately was a waste of my time. I'm glad I read through them because now I have a better understanding of like the broad spectrum support that's out there. But for women who aren't going to read through everything, it must get very frustrating. And I wanted to give up several times, but I just couldn't. I didn't have the choice.
Yeah, as we had discussed on our previous podcast, I had the situation where when my father-in-law passed away, we gave my mother-in-law a checklist of things she had to do.
Yeah.
And the funeral home gave her a checklist of things she had to do. And my mother-in-law at the time was in her early 80s, and she took these checklists and stuck them in a drawer and never looked at them.
It's incredibly overwhelming, especially for someone, in their 80s. It's a lot to do. And that's why I say it's like wedding planning, but for funerals. If you look at what it takes to go into planning a wedding, you spend 9 months, a year and a half planning a wedding. And it's that same level of detail and planning that goes into planning a funeral. And most people slap it together in 3 to 5 days. So you're cutting corners and you're missing on opportunities and you're not including things that maybe they wanted or you want, or you look back in 10 years and go, oh, I really hate that that's the way that went down. Wouldn't you rather look back in 10 years and be like, yeah, we really honored this person. We really did right by them, and have a little bit of closure and have a little bit of peace with the situation. So one of my other blogs I do is I put the fun in funeral, and it talks about the funeral planning services and really like goes at length into what it is. And I don't think people realize how much is involved in planning a funeral.
No, you talk about putting fun in funerals, and obviously you're celebrating the person's life who you just lost. I mean, I always, my mom had 2 sisters and a brother, and we had a family reunion many, many years ago. And there were a whole bunch of people there because I'm the oldest of 7, and there's a lot of kids around. And she was wearing a T-shirt that said, "I put the fun in dysfunctional."
Yeah.
I have a great picture of her with her 2 sisters wearing that with their husbands and so on and so forth. But yeah, it is a celebration, and you're talking about putting together a checklist. And she was actually very organized about this. I mean, she was very spiritual and so on and so forth, and didn't want to inconvenience us. So like 10 years ago, she gave me a list of how she wanted her funeral to be, what she wanted to do, and so on and so forth, right down to the readings and everything else, and started giving me other information. And I'm saying, Mom, don't hit me with this stuff and whatever. And but eventually it does. And my dad, we lost him a year and a half before we lost her. And it was very, very helpful because what she did for herself, I actually used for him first. And but yeah, it's so important to get that together. And if you just do it once and you have it, then hopefully it doesn't happen quickly, but at least it's there. And as far as what you have to do really doesn't change over the years, I don't think. I mean, how you do it may, but on the different I's you got to dot and T's you got to cross, get that down in a list once and have it someplace where you can go to it and share it with other people like you're doing. It's so important.
Absolutely. And she gave you a roadmap is essentially what she did. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do for other people. And people need to do it for themselves, especially people my age. They think like, oh, I'm in my 30s, I'm in my 40s. I don't need to think about my funeral. No, number one thing that needs to happen is you need to have a will. I don't care if you've never had a full-time job in your life. You need to have a will because going through probate sucks, pardon my French. And people think, oh, well, I'll just write down what I want and, keep it in the safe. Like, no, that's not legally binding. So what you need to do when you do a will is also do a living will. And that's going to be legally binding. It's going to be notarized by the attorney who does your estate plan. You're going to keep all those documents together and it's going to have those preferential decisions made and make somebody's life either. Because God forbid you step off the curb, you get hit by a bus. What's your family supposed to do? Your loved ones, your next of kin supposed to do? We all aren't as fortunate enough to live into our 70s, 80s, or 90s. And wouldn't you want the people who are caring for you in that aftermath to have it as easy as possible? It's not about you grappling with your own mortality or not wanting to make people uncomfortable, but you're giving them a gift by making it easy on them to give them that time to actively mourn and grieve, as opposed to make these decisions that they don't really want to make anyway.
Yeah, it is hard to get people to understand that, yes, nobody wants to consider their own mortality, but life does go on. And there's certain things that you can do to make it easier for those you're leaving behind. Now, in your case, again, it was fairly sudden that you found yourself in this predicament, but for a lot of people, they're dealing with ongoing illnesses or situations. Do you work with folks before they have to deal with the death?
Absolutely. So one of the other services that I offer is I connect people with something that's called a death doula. Um, People who know about birthing doulas will know what that means, but it's kind of somewhere between like a hospice nurse and a social worker and a therapist, and they can do that bedside care and offer that emotional support. So I'll do those types of resources in the pre-planning stages as well. The person doesn't have to be deceased. I actually am working with one family right now based out of Vermont, and they've been given 6 months. And so the families come to me and said, hey, we want everything in place. And I'm like, great. We've connected with the funeral home. They've prepaid for the funeral arrangements. We've made all the selections there. And then we're, meeting with the estate lawyer. And then we're meeting, to make sure the will is finalized before anybody passes and everyone's still, coherent and cognizant. We've connected them with the death doula. And then I'm there, like they're texting me and they're getting, feedback from doctors and they're getting, questions that they need answered. And I'm like, I don't have that answer for you, but I 100% will find out. And I'll reach out to my network of resources, whether it be, like life insurance questions, financial planning questions, drawing on pensions, those types of things. So setting them up to be the most successful when something happens. Because in the long term, those families experience a secondary type of grief. And if they're not actively participating in the present right now, that can be really compounded. They're grieving the potential for this person to pass away and they're missing out on being present in the moment. And then once the person passes, they'll go through the stages of grief as well. So what I'm trying to do is take some of that fear and anxiety out of them passing and let them be present.
Yeah, you have the communications, now you have the resources. And then I noticed in your website, you said the next step in my path includes completing a grief coach certification course and continue to grow this resource. So tell me about that. Tell us about that. I mean, that's really, obviously that sounds wonderful. And to have that title, I think says it all and would make a whole lot of people a lot easier to approach you. So tell us about what's that, what is that all about?
So the National Grief Organization is an accredited and certified health service provider, and they do coaching certifications. They do trauma certifications. So if I go through the grief coaching certification, I'm then certified under an accredited organization to offer counseling and resources for, children loss, parent loss, sibling loss, spouse loss. So it would be all that encompassing umbrella. It basically just adds a little bit of credibility to the anecdotal that I already have. And, I'm only 2.5 years out. So this would give me less of that personal filter, more of that professional filter. And while I'll still be able to relate with people, it gives people a little bit of peace of mind to have someone with a title. I do have an office space that I currently work out of in Enfield, Connecticut, where I can meet clients there. I can do remote services. I can travel to them. But sometimes people prefer that, that piece of paper that helps them understand that I'm serious about this and I'm not just in it for the clout. I'm really here to make a difference and help people. The other benefit to that certification is it gives me leverage when time comes to make active changes to the legislation around bereavement leave. So I found out after Craig passed away that the Connecticut state law in regards to bereavement leave is incredibly limited. For most employers, they legally are obligated to give you 3 days of bereavement leave. 3 days. You're 50% of your personality, your identity, your household dies, and you get 3 days. Most employers are kind enough to give you 5. After that, it comes out of your PTO or short-term disability, or you take FMLA, and that's a non-paid leave, and that's good for another 10 weeks. So all said and done, you get like less than 3 months. When a baby is born in the state of Connecticut, you automatically default get 16 weeks paid compensation of maternity leave, 12 weeks paternity leave. There's a disparity between someone entering your family and exiting your family. So I want to create a little bit of fairness around that. That's a long-term goal for me.
Yeah, it is a very different situation when you're dealing with a loss than when a baby comes in. But people don't realize how long grieving can take. I mean, even when you're, back at work, moving on, there are triggers where something will show up and it'll trigger a memory and the grieving starts again. Or it's really a bad way of phrasing it because it's not that it ended and started, but
it brings it back to the surface.
Yes.
I'd say there's a difference between mourning and between grieving. Mourning is really that like initial phase, and it can be as short as 6 weeks and it can be long as 6 years. It's different for each person. But then you get to a place where you're like, okay, I've made peace with what happened and like I've accepted it and I'm maybe still angry about it, but I'm back at work and I'm relatively functional. And that's grieving, and that's when you go to the grocery store and I see his favorite Italian ice on sale and I burst into tears and have to sit on the floor at Stop and Shop and people look at me and literally step over my legs and are like, weirdo. Like you get really comfortable at it. Or I had to abandon a cart. I think I was at Target. I had to abandon the cart because like I got a whiff of his cologne on somebody else and I just like lost it. I had to leave. I literally had to leave the store. It happens all the time. I forget something's in the refrigerator and I'm like, oh, or I accidentally buy something like from the grocery store. I don't eat mustard personally, but like it was on sale the other day and I picked it up and I put it in the cart and I go to the checkout and I'm like, why? And then it dawned on me what I was doing because it was just sheer reflex, even 2 years later. And I hadn't bought mustard in a year and a half. And now here I am. So your brain plays tricks on you and grieving never ends. It's becomes part of you and you have to learn who you are post loss. It's discovering that new identity and untangling yourself from that other person to a degree and putting to rest those things, those shared things. And that can be with a parent too, or a sibling or a child. Your identity changes and you have to really learn who you are in this new phase of your life.
It does. And yeah, you're talking about being so much a part of someone's life, it never really leaves you. I mean, my mother passed away 25 years ago, and there are still times where something will pop up and I'll go, oh, I got to tell mom about this. And then suddenly realize, oh, she's, been gone for quite a while. These things pop up. And also when you're dealing with the grief, there's other factors that come in when you're dealing with the loss of a parent. All sorts of issues come up with siblings.
Yeah.
So have you dealt with things like that? Do you have recommendations for people that, how they can get help with these things?
Well, first I'd like to say that I always say that grief is just the love you never got to give while they were still alive.
Oh, I like that.
Yes.
Grief is just the love you never got to give them while they were still alive. So that never goes away. As long as you love them, that never goes away. And that's perfectly acceptable. So as far as dealing with like siblings and stuff like that, I think the best thing you can do is in a situation where you know it's coming, everybody needs to be a part of it. Everyone needs to go to the appointments with the lawyers, and some are going to be more comfortable with that than others. But keeping that line of communication open and keeping those expectations open for what's to come. It's when it's sprung on you and it's like, well, mom said I was going to get this, this, and this. And then in the will, I got this, this, and this. And there's animosity there. And then understanding that everybody's grieving process is different. Some people, grief looks like anger. Some people, grief looks like apathy. Some people, grief looks like addiction. And all of those, within moderation, are completely okay. You can't project your own form of grief or grieving onto someone else. You have to take your time in your space in your grieving process and understand that that might not be how they grieve. I think we run into a lot of problems in that interpersonal connection when we expect people to grieve a certain way, or they're not sad. They didn't, like, what the heck is going on with that? Well, because they're not in a place where their brain can let them be sad. They've compartmentalized it or blacked it out, or, like, oh, they're drinking too much. It's like, well, they'll either come around or you'll host an intervention. Like, it comes a point where intervention, not literally, but like those conversations are necessary. But you have to understand that you can't impose your own grieving onto them. That's probably the best way you can be successful, is communicate and meet them where they're at.
Right. So we are coming up on the end of our time. If there was one thing that you would want someone who's grieving to know, what would it be?
Say their name. I don't care. And that's more for the support people. But someone asks me all the time, like, I don't want to say I'm so sorry or my condolences. It feels so empty. And I'm like, because it's become a platitude. How do you help someone who's grieving? Say their name. Give them their identity back. Just because they're gone doesn't mean their identity is gone. I talk about Craig all the time, and sometimes I forget, like, I'm talking about him like he's still here. And it makes people uncomfortable, but it gets old to say my late husband, or, and then you try to be gentle with other people because not everybody's comfortable. So I don't want to say my dead husband. Like, say their name. Ask me what your favorite, ask me my favorite memory of him, or, comment on something that I've said about him. Say their name.
All right. And if somebody needs help getting through the grieving process, how can they get a hold of you?
I would love for people to visit the website. It's www.otwwb.com. On Tuesdays, wewearblack.com. I can be reached via email, and that is on Tuesdays, wewearblack@gmail.com. And then on the website, there's a phone number. People can text me, they can call me. So definitely, I'm on Facebook and on Instagram for Tuesdays We Wear Black. And the Tuesdays We Wear Black, next time I'd be happy to share with you where the origin of that comes from. It's about Craig, just fun fact. But yes, I'm hoping that people, if nothing else, they go to the website and they learn something for themselves, but I'd be happy to help people.
All right. Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway for this week?
Wow. Well, first of all, I mean, we're all human. So grieving is perfectly normal. It's perfectly natural. You shouldn't beat yourself up over it because it just happens. And obviously you talk about different instances where it just hits you. So get the help, get the support that you want, and realize that everybody takes this differently. You talked about yourself as a type A. You took charge about this and are paying this forward with your experiences and your love of everybody out there just by helping them out and directing them with this. A lot of other people, as you're saying, they're going to keep it inside, and you're wondering why don't they react and so on and so forth. We're all human. We all grieve. We all do it differently. So thank you so much for the support that you're giving everybody. I love the grief coach certification, because the bottom line, the fact that you're taking it and the fact that there's something out there really, really brings a whole lot of credibility to that whole situation. So it's fantastic that you're doing what you're doing, and just keep on doing it. God bless.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, the big thing for people to remember is, grieving is one of the most difficult things anybody goes through, losing a loved one, but you are not alone. There is support out there, there is help out there. Reach out, Get the help you need. Don't try to shoulder all the burden. There is help, and we all need a helping hand sometimes. So I think that's the big takeaway for me this week. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Audible, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. We'll see you then.